Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar in the CWG Lounge. It's wonderful to have you here. My name is Jonathan Steyn. I'm a educator, wine business educator, researcher, and business strategist, mainly based at the Graduate School of Business, where I run a few courses. So I come pretty much from an academic background. But before we begin, I just want to outline the purpose and then introduce the panel and then just give a short introduction to what we're going to be covering this afternoon. So thank you all for joining. It's wonderful to have you all here today, and I hope that you're going to experience a very insightful and robust discussion about something that's incredibly important in the South African wine landscape. So the purpose is to really unpack the topic of investing in South African fine wine. And we want to look at it with a special focus on the auction channel and then zoom in to the CWG auction as a sort of benchmark auction for fine wine in the South African wine industry. So I'm going to just introduce the panel. I'd ask them just to say hello, give us a wave. Don't forget to turn on your mic, and so you can just tell everybody hello. The first is joining us from London, Richard Harvey MW. He's the international. Hi, Richard, and welcome. Richard is international director for Bonhams, a very important person in the world of fine wine. And then I'd like to introduce Khensani Nobanda, and she's from a very important institution in South Africa, Nedbank, especially in these times. She's the group executive for marketing and corporate affairs at Nedbank.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan.
Hi, Khensani, welcome. Who's been partnering with the CWG for many, many years. And then I'd like to introduce Roland Peens, who's the director of Wine Cellar, a very wise man when it comes to investing in fine wine.
Hi, everyone.
And then Higgo Jacobs, who's a sommelier and wine consultant, very experienced man, also very familiar with the auction game. And so he will be able to provide some valuable insights for us throughout the program today. Welcome, Higgo.
Good afternoon.
So I thought I'd just introduce it, not for very long, but just to say, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. Wine is what they call a hedonic product. It's experiential, it's often culturally symbolic, and it's emotional. And so people derive different types of value out of it. And there are different types of value. Transcendent value, for example, is value that's derived from speaking to the moral compass. So if something is sustainable, it often speaks to consumers because they have a connection with that, or there's a connection between their own values and that the value given by a particular wine brand. But the question around wine, and the big question today, is undoubtedly, is wine, fine wine that is it a good investment? What is investing what does investing in wine mean? What does it actually mean? Are you looking at it from a collector's perspective, or are you looking at it from purely an investor's perspective who's looking to make a return over time? The other interesting thing about the discussion today is this word called premiumizing, which has cropped up in the South African wine language of late, and something I've been involved in studying from an academic point of view. And simply put, premiumizing is about improving status and value. For wine brands, it can be for any brand, it can be for the South African country brand. And I think to a certain extent, going back and actually having been a buyer and seller of CWG wine in my previous life as a restaurateur, I'm sure Roland will remember bidding against me on a few occasions. So in my time there, the CWG was showing massive growth in value over time, and a very stable quantity being sold every year. I had a look at some of the figures Kate showed me, and in 2004, so over the last 15 years, the average price at the auction in 2004 was 178 Rand. In 2019, that is 811 Rand. The average quantity over time has been about 14,000 bottles, which is with a very sort of small margin of variation on either side. So we can say that this product is not responsive to price. And that's delivering great value at a very stable amount of quantity, and is developing and creating premium every year. So it was very interesting to go and look at the figures and see where we've come from and where we are now. And it makes me ask a lot of questions about premiumizing the South African country brand. And that means, how do we increase our reputational status on international markets? And how do we deliver greater premium and value? And maybe this investing in South African fine wine is part of that question of status and value. But I'm not going to try and impose on the discussion. I want to start off with our first topic, or, you know, in academic terms, I often call them pastures, because you go there, you graze, and you digest on all these ideas. And when you're full, you move on to the next pasture. Hopefully you've grazed it flat. But I'm just going to call them topics. And the first topic is for us to understand, what does investing in fine wine mean? You know, it maybe means different things to different people. Maybe there's a solid economic argument. But I here to sort of have a chat about it is, firstly, Roland Peens. Maybe he can just contextualize it in South Africa. And then we're going to ask Richard to then comment, and Richard's then going to go and look at the international level. So just before I get hand over to Roland, if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A. We'll pick up and try and select. Hopefully we're going to get really great questions, and we'll try to answer some of them. But if they're general questions, just say this is a general question. If you want to ask a specific panelist a certain question, please go ahead. So Roland, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think what's really important is to define what fine wine is, because in South African we often clump fine wine with beverages, and really they're two different products. And for me, a fine wine is a wine that can't be replicated. It's linked to a terroir, and the producer making that fine wine is aiming for utter quality. And that's really an important definition to have. And then what is investing in fine wine? Well, it's really linked to the fact that fine wines need time in bottle to mature, and it takes some time for them to mature. So let's call it 10 years for top wines around South Africa or internationally to mature. Most customers are not willing or able to buy wines and put them down for 10 years. Which then leads to the opportunity for some consumers to buy the wine, store it for 10 years, and then sell it on to those consumers who are looking for mature wines in the market. And that's really the premise, and it's probably started in the fine wine market of the UK, where one would buy 3 cases of first growths or 3 cases of Bordeaux, and 10 years later sell the one first growth case to pay for the other 2. So there wasn't always a monetary motivation, but there was a motivation to drink for free, which I kind of like. So that market has been available in UK, in Europe for quite some time, but we haven't had that in South Africa. Why? Well, we live in a very sunny country. There are not very many storage operations. So when you do store wine, it really is important that it's stored correctly. So we haven't had a lot of stock in the market that is mature. Secondly, we haven't produced a lot of fine wine. Yes, we had great producers in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but there wasn't a culture of cellaring wine, and arguably the wines at the time weren't very high quality. So today we're in a different realm. South African fine wines are absolutely booming. The quality is at a new level, And now the opportunity is there to buy wines, put them away, and over time, they could appreciate to a point where you could sell them and really make a decent return. So we're in a very exciting landscape at the moment. There's not enough time to talk about how we got to that place, but what's important is we're making the best wines that we've ever made in South Africa, in my view. And a lot of the critics are talking the same sort of rhetoric, with 300-point wines from Tin Matkin and Neil Martin this year. So really, we have arrived on the international stage. What's most important, however, is that our wines are the cheapest in the world, not only at the entry level, but at the top end level as well. So if you had to take the average 90-point rating from Vinous or Wine Spectator or Robert Parker and compare that to the average 90-point wine from around the world, we would be the cheapest in the world. And that's at an entry level and at a premium level. And to give you an example of that, if you take the most expensive wine in the world, which happens to be Romani Conti, 2015 vintage, you're going to pay R500,000 for that bottle. And an entry-level French wine will cost you about 30 Rand. So the multiple there is about 15,000 times between the entry-level and the most expensive. In South Africa, that multiple is about 100, from 25 Rand to 2,500 Rand. So really, our fine wines are too close to the cheaper wines, and that gap is getting bigger and bigger each year. And as that gap gets bigger, as the prices progress, that gives more opportunity for fine wine investment.
Thank you,
Richard.
Roland. We'll come back to you now. Richard, you want to add in and maybe just talk a little bit about the auction markets globally and investment wine in that context, and then maybe focusing on South Africa. What's the potential here with the CWG auction in mind?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I've got to say that wine is the most appalling investment compared to all the other products that we, as an international auction house, offer, which are art, furniture, jewelry, watches, cars. All these items you can put on a wall, you can drive, you can wear, but wine is made to be drunk. And of course, once the bottle's been opened, it has no value at all. So I think it's dangerous to associate wine in the same way as we look at other non-solid investments that we sell. The point being is that really wine should reflect the costs involved in producing it. I like to see the value of a wine, and I'd love to see the value of the wine going on the primary market to the producers who are producing a wine. Roland's just mentioned, South African wines are the cheapest of fine wines on the world market at the moment. And really what we would hope to do by taking on and hosting the Cape Winemakers Guild auction is to increase the value, the release value of these wines. Sure, there will be an increase as the buyers perhaps hold the wines, mature them, and then sell them on market again. But one shouldn't be looking for absurd increases in price. And I think we need to sort of detach ourselves from that kind of investment. As far as South Africa's concerned and the general auction market, South Africa's really not made an impact very much as yet in the secondary market of wines. But what is clear, and I got some data this morning from Livex, which is the London-based fine wine exchange, which is quite interesting. So I have to look at it. But in about 2010, 2011, which was when the Chinese first came into buying wine big time, Bordeaux accounted for something like 90% of the wines traded. This has now gone to, it's half of that, 45%, and last month it dropped even lower to 34%. So what is apparent is that new wines are coming in and being bought and traded by fine wine merchants. So first of all, it was Burgundy came in, but Burgundy's very expensive in small production. And this year, I think, last month, the running total for this year for the rest of the world, so that is outside Bordeaux, Burgundy, Rhone, the rest of the world includes the USA, Australia, South Africa, Spain, has more than doubled from 5 to 12% of the fine wine market as traded on Livex. So clearly the buyers are looking for wines beyond the traditional Bordeaux, Burgundy areas. And one of the things that I think could be very interesting for South Africa is that the plus in Bordeaux, where all the class growths of Bordeaux were traded and have been for many years, has been started recently for the last 2 years, and more and more wines are being offered by producers outside the area. So we have quite a lot of USA wines, a lot of Italian wines, and for the first time this year, a couple of Australian wines are being offered on an international market. I think the producers realize that the traditional routes of distribution are not as effective as getting them on the international radar as the traditional merchants in Bordeaux, who have had years of putting out fine wines through the world. So that's, I think, a very interesting area that perhaps South Africa could explore.
Great, thank you, Richard. Roland, do you want to come in here? Do you agree? I mean, how do you see the attractiveness of wine as an investment compared to other products in your own business?
It's a tough one, and I get what you're saying, Richard, and we all love drinking wine, but there gets to a point where your bottle of wine that you purchased is so valuable, you look at it as an investment rather than a drink. And I've got the same in my cellar, where, wow, this wine's gone up to such a price that I actually just can't open it. I'll rather sell it. So yes, the wine is a lovely drink and it can be consumed, but I think one can look at it as an investment as well. I agree wholeheartedly that we need to pass the value on to the producers, because that's really how you create sustainability and how you increase the quality across the board. If the merchants or the middlemen are making the profits, that doesn't lead to increasing the value within the chain. So absolutely, the end goal here is for the producers to sell wines at a higher price. And that can only be dictated to by the secondary market. So we've been trading Bordeaux for the last 20 years, and we can see quite closely that those wines that trade at a higher price on the secondary market dictate the future release prices of the Bordeaux. So if you're not trading at a high level on the secondary market, there's no ways that you can trade at a high level on release. And that's really important. And that's why we desperately need a secondary market in South Africa, so that the market can decide what the true value of the wine is, not the marketing department or the director of an operation.
Thanks for introducing my next question, Roland. Perfectly judged. Higgo, maybe you can just come in here and share some of your thoughts about the emergence of a secondary market in South Africa for wine, and then maybe we can just cycle back to Richard to give us maybe a sort of future, a peek into the future, and maybe Roland can also just peek into the future and see where we're headed. I mean, what kind of returns can we expect in 10 years' time?
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm not a bold view on returns, and I'm certainly no investment expert, but what we can't deny is that there's been an upswing in fine in South Africa. We're starting to see the emerging fine wine markets. Interesting, good alternative investment.
Oh dear, Higgo does live in Elgin,
but
the signal's not good there.
I think the key question is, can you not hear me well?
No, Higgo, it's breaking up, unfortunately.
Hear me okay now?
Try again, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah?
Yes, we can.
So I'm just, sorry about that. I'm just, what I'd like to say is I don't think South African wine, we haven't been viewing our fine wine as an actual legitimate asset class. So I think we probably haven't actually filled that space of SA wine being seen as a passion asset. So, you know, passion assets, of course, legitimately should be viewed as something for enjoyment. It's a passion asset. I agree there with Richard. We shouldn't try to change that and now try and evolve wine into this investment class. I think the primary role is to eventually drink it, and that's what potential buyers must stick to. Buy what you love. However, you know, it does make a legitimate alternative for investment for many reasons. Obviously, in financial uncertainty.
Have we lost? Higgo, you still with us?
Yeah, sorry, I can hear you guys perfectly, but it seems you can't hear me. So I'll move a little bit, perhaps move on, Jonathan, and then I'll tap in again in a moment.
Great. Okay, okay, so Richard, how do you, peering into the future, what is your forecast for the South African wine category, fine wine category going forward globally, and especially focusing on the auction channel? Are you seeing glimmers of hope in the future?
I think we certainly will do. What is clear is that so much wine is now sold on initial release by critic scores. All these wines that I've mentioned that have been released in the last or this month on the Bordeaux Place, they're literally sold on a score compared to previous year's scores, and that obviously is a very important issue for collectors. So therefore you come back to the fact that as Roland mentioned, we've had 100-point wines from Neil Martin and Tim Atkin for South African wines, and that's undoubtedly going to feed through in terms of when buyers see these wines on the market. What I would say at the moment, there is very little South African wine appearing on the secondary market as far as auctioneers are concerned. In fact, interestingly, I got a list from Livex who started listing South African wines 6 years ago. They probably have about 10 estates that are traded there. I won't cause envy by mentioning names, but I expect you out there you will know the majority of them. So there clearly is a secondary market building, but it has a long way to go. We might have said the same about Australia not that long ago, and certainly the USA and Chile, South America generally. And those wines now, because they've got a succession of vintages with high scores, and older vintages are now beginning to be released onto the secondary market, particularly the auction market. You have to remember that we are generally selling wines that are significantly older than are generally offered through the trade. So as I say, I have great hopes because Richard, I know the quality is there in South Africa.
I could just add to that, there's a lot of rhetoric about scores.
Sorry.
Yeah, Roland, just one short point, because I actually want to point you in a little bit of a different direction in a second, but complete your point, absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about scores quickly because I think a lot of consumers are jumping onto this 100-point bandwagon, and there's a bit of a pushback from the producers saying, you know, you should be buying my wine because of what it is, not because it gets 100 points from some dude in the UK. But what's important about scores is it builds brand equity. Over time, consumers need some sort of metric to understand quality. And if over time your wine gets a very high score, that builds brand equity and it builds your brand and your pricing. And there's a palpable impact on the market. When Porcelain Bag got 100 points last week, this effectively sold the entire allocation of porcelain bag before it's been released. Whereas 1 year ago, when the 2017 was released, that wine was available for the entire year. And the same thing happened with Paul Sour. It sold out in 1 day versus a number of months that it used to take to sell out. And that's really what the critic scores and the hype does. It shifts the goalposts and puts South Africa onto a new level.
Roland, can I just come back quickly, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure, Richard.
Just to say, it's exactly the same. The Bordeaux producers, when Robert Parker was first making his marks, all sort of poo-pooed it and said, no, we really, we want our wines to be appreciated. But you can be certain that once they were talking privately, they were absolutely thrilled to get these marks, and it helped them commercially enormously. So I don't think that the growers there need to be too worried. But I agree this point that there seems to be a big difference between a 95-point wine and a 100-point wine in terms of consumer perception, and that really is not the case in terms of quality at all. So we can get fixated on 100 points.
Thank you, Richard. I couldn't agree more with you and Roland. And just to add to that, I just did a study on old vines, and in fact, we did a pricing study and we valued the price of one wine searcher rating point. It was really interesting when combined with the old vine attribute. And it was really interesting to see the graduation as the rating point went up. And Wine Searcher does an aggregated rating, so we found that to be quite a good measure of everybody's ratings, and they use a particular algorithm, which they don't really share with anybody. But we found for point, and this is obviously in the South African wine context, the price of the wine went up by 66 Rand, and this was absolutely statistically significant. So it was really, really interesting, and what you're saying is incredibly valid. And I guess that has an impact greatly on auction prices and probably contributes to the secondary market if I'm hearing what Roland is saying. Higgo, you're around there. Do you want to jump in at all?
Yes, please. Can you guys hear me better now? Yeah? Can you hear me? So I was just busy typing to you, Jonathan, to ask you if I can just quickly remake my point. So thanks for cutting me in there. What I was saying is, I feel that South African fine wine, firstly, just the term South African fine wine, I think is something fairly new. And I completely agree with Roland there. There's a massive distinction that we must make between our fine wines and just the beverage class of volume wines traded in retail. So our fine wines, I don't think, have actually occupied a space as a passion asset. I think we're only now starting to rightfully take that space of our fine wines being a passion asset. And with that happening, whether we want to argue that it's a wise thing, buy wine or all of the above as an investment class, times like this prove, when there's financial instability, it proves that physical assets are a good idea because they're not attached to the stock markets and to other market performance, and you don't pay tax on the income. So I think it is attractive. We've seen what happened over the past 5 years, and I think it's on the back of the emergence of or the rise in quality of South African fine wine. One final point that I will make is I think our supply side is more mature than our demand, and we still have to work on establishing a fine wine culture.
Great. Thanks, Higgo, for actually segueing into my next point. And maybe I can just allow Richard and Roland to comment. Roland in particular, I mean, how mature is the South African investment wine market? It seems pretty nascent, which means that it's quite young. There might have been some semblance of it around for some time, but it's something that seems to be growing in momentum. I mean, at this stage, can fine wine, I mean, Richard would probably disagree with this, is that can fine wine be put into a portfolio of investments to hedge against other investments in other asset classes. I mean, we're not clearly at that point yet, but I wanted to ask your opinion, you know, and then we'll come on to a next question related to that and ask Higgo to cycle back on that. So Roland, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so I can give you some international figures. The fine wine market is worth about £5 billion. And if you look at LiveX and the index over the COVID era, there certainly wasn't a V-shaped curve like the rest of the equity markets and so on. Wine was fairly stable throughout. So had you had a portfolio of fine wine, you would have mitigated against that huge drop in equities around the world. So I believe that there completely is a case for this alternative asset of fine wine. It's uncorrelated to equities, which means it certainly does have a value. But if you look at South Africa, our wine industry is about 30 billion rand. Wine is about 9 billion of that. And I think fine wine is about 400 to 500 million. That's fine wine that's being traded. And then the secondary market is probably around 30 million. So it's a drop in the ocean. And that 30 million is, let's call it Cape Winemakers Guild. Let's talk about all the vintage wine that's sold by various merchants, the Strauss auctions and so on. So, but 5 years ago, that was maybe 5 or 6 million. So we really are growing quite steeply, and there's no reason why in time it can't be higher. That said, it can't grow too quickly because there isn't enough wine. 400 million rands worth of wine is not a lot. That's about as much as one chateau in the Medoc produces in one vintage. So it's a tiny amount of wine that we produce, and we need to make far more fine wine so that it can penetrate the international market.
Roland, very valid and important information. Thank you for sharing that with us. I was always wondering what the value of this market was. Richard, do you want to jump in here as a man who has a really very much a helicopter view of this from a global side? I mean, do you support what Roland says?
Yes, I think it's very valid if you're comparing wine to stocks and shares. But if you compared wine to another asset class like art or watches, cars even, then you're not talking such the value of those has held up pretty well. Of course, the asset that's increased most dramatically over the last sort of 2 or 3 years is whiskey, but that's another subject. I think the important thing for South Africa is to try and develop brands that are, if you look at how Bordeaux and then Burgundy developed, there are obviously, as Roland mentioned, Bordeaux Chateau mostly produce large volumes. Burgundy is producing very small volumes, but certain producers, obviously Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, but growers like Rousseau, Roumier, small volume, but they've got real brand awareness because people latched on to Burgundy. Champagne has a strong brand awareness. So I think how it will develop is with perhaps 10 or a dozen estates that have sufficient volume to be able to get those wines through onto an international market. And that really in the end comes down to their distribution systems outside of South Africa. Clearly the major collectors and buyers of South African wines are the South African diaspora, and obviously a few others who travel to South Africa and just love the country and get to know the wines. But still, they haven't had the kind of exposure that they really need as yet to become important in the fine wine market. But this is what we're trying to do with the Cape Winemakers Guild auction. It's going to be a long process. We're not going to do it overnight.
Thanks, Richard. And I'm glad to see my friend, old friend Remington Norman from my days in the restaurant business, and I've shared many a fine wine with him. He just made a comment, not a question. He says very few wines fall into the investable category. This is not the same as saying that a wine won't increase in value. The criteria of investability are scarcity, quality, and demand. Demand refers to the international demand. Most of Bordeaux falls outside this frame on volume grounds. For example, Lafite, 20,000 times 12 bottles per year. In SA, there's probably only one possible contender, and that is Vin de Constance. And even this is shaky. Plenty to add about the SA market, but this will do for now. Well, hopefully we get a chance to chat, Remington. It's nice to hear from you. Any comment, Roland, on this?
Yeah, all valid points. I mean, Romani Conti is only a few thousand bottles, so it's very small and scarce. We have a number of fine wines which are also scarce, and that creates investability on them. But yes, we're at the start of a very long journey here. So one can put a lot of holes in fine wine investment in the secondary market in South Africa, absolutely. But we can see the end game here, and it's just going to take some time to develop the market. What you need is liquidity. You need data, and neither of those we've had. So if we can provide liquidity and data to the consumer, along with reasonable volume and high scores, which is what's happening, then I do believe in a secondary market, and it is growing. So yeah, maybe we should hear from the bankers to tell us if we're on the wrong track.
Yes, we're getting to them. I think before we get to Khensani, because I really wanted to start this conversation just now, but before that, I just want to, it's the question on everybody's mind, and I was really reflecting on it this morning, is we're dealing with highly inelastic markets. They're not very responsive to changes in price, possibly up to a certain point. I mean, I saw that clearly in the CWG data this morning. You don't need to have a calculator to even work that one out. But we're going into a period of financial constraint. I'm so tired of the jargon around this, new normal, pivot points, to name a few. So Richard, maybe you can just come in, and then I can go to Khensani and ask her from a financial investment point of view, what have they seen in the financial markets with investment? I mean, are assets cheap? So are wines as an investable asset cheap now? Is it a good time to buy? What is the sentiment in the market like over this difficult period? So firstly to Richard, and then we'll introduce Khensani, and then we'll have another discussion about who actually is the investor. So Richard, you want to jump in here?
Well, I think what we noticed, we had an auction in July, and we noticed that, and this is backed up from evidence from fine wine traders in the UK, is that a lot of the drinking was perhaps dropping down a step. So people were not perhaps drinking such expensive wines, but still drinking good wines. But in terms of the pricing, we were finding that the older and rarer bottles, particularly we had bottles of Blanc 47, these iconic wines were fetching very high prices, because I think people realize those they're less and less of those bottles all the time. It's rare to unearth them, so the prices of those were exceptionally high, and I think perhaps that is how the market was perhaps polarizing two ways. I think, as Roland said, the the prices of wines have held up steadily. They've not really been affected by COVID-19, but I think drinking habits probably have changed a bit, and certainly iconic, unique wines will be chased up because, as you quoted from Remington, there needs to be the criteria to establish a really investable wine. So certainly the wines that have increased dramatically have been those that already have a track record, which usually means wines of some age and, you know, of a great vintage and particularly good provenance.
So I can add just one quick thing, Jonathan.
Yes, sure.
Around COVID-19, what it has done is added the two important factors in wine investment, and that's liquidity and market information. Why? Because people have been at home on the internet looking at wine, not out and about. And that's an important point, because we're finding in our retail business more and more customers finding us because they have nothing else to do but to be online and looking at fine wine, and that's important. So you've seen it with online retail in all sectors, but in fine wine too. The numbers in the UK, Richard, I'm sure you've seen, have really surged in fine wine retail, online retail,
sure.
And then online auctions as well. So I expect the same with the CWG auction. You're effectively allowing more and more consumers to bid on the same product, and therefore the prices should remain fairly robust.
Yeah. So Richard, you spoke a little bit before we get on to Khensani, and Higgo, I'll circle back to you because I just want to get a perspective on Khensani before we should get to Khensani. Richard, you mentioned a polarization, and when I was in Europe last year, or recently, speaking to friends of mine in the luxury wine business, on the very high end, there seems to be an upward pressure on price, high demand, very, very buoyant kind of market. Are you experiencing the same thing?
Yes, very much so. But it is for a very limited number of wines, you know, and obviously Romani Conti is the classic example, or Rousseau Chambertin, Henri Jaet, if they're not fake. I mean, there's pressure on these unique wines because they are no longer produced, and the quantity available diminishes the whole time. But I think on the general market overall, I think prices have held up well. There's not been any fire sales as far as I'm aware of. You know, I've not had people saying, you know, I need to raise 100,000. The Cellar's got to go, and that again helps to keep the market reasonably buoyant. So the majority of people we sell to are collectors. They're going to buy wine. They're ultimately probably going to sell some, but they'll drink as much as they can, and that obviously, as wine gets consumed, then there's less of it about for people to trade. So that helps the market.
Thanks, Richard. So Khensani, thank you again for being here. So maybe if you can just share your perspective from the general investment climate and market in South Africa. Is there a similar type of polarization? I mean, can one say that? Can one even draw any conclusions or comparisons between wine and other asset classes?
So, I mean, Jonathan, I've actually enjoyed this conversation because if I go back to a question Roland asked me before it started was, you know, do banks consider wine an asset class? And I mean, I think the answer is no, to be honest, if we have to be direct. And what I really love what Higgo said about a passion asset, because ultimately I think that's what it is. And for someone like me personally who loves wine, I actually always think about it in that sense, because this conversation highlights exactly why banks don't necessarily look at it as, you know, an asset that they would recommend their clients to invest in or want to give someone money to be able to invest in, because there's so many polarizing views. There's no clear, you know, direction in terms of this is what good value is. And I think actually fundamentally more important is what Higgo said about the demand side versus the supply side of the market. I think that just really makes it difficult for banks to be able to say, this is an asset that we would, really say our clients can grow value from. But if you go back to what a passion asset is, which I think is the fundamental bit of this, right, and it goes back to our involvement with the CWG. So wine is like a massive contributor to the South African GDP. So if you think about, if I'm investing in something, and even if I don't get the value in the long term from an asset growth perspective, what are some of the things emotionally that can actually make me think, look, that was a good investment, right? One, definitely it's a massive GDP contributor. You look at the jobs that it has, not just from the people who work on the farms, but from tourism. You look at CWG specifically and the work that it does in driving transformation in South Africa, trying to get young proteges, Black proteges into the wine industry. For me, I think if as an investor, you walk into it with that mindset where it might not necessarily, be something that's going to give you, the right sort of increase in value in 10 years' time. And in fact, you'll probably drink it anyway. At least the emotional value behind it should be something that drives, the decisions that you make when it comes to wine investments. So yeah, I think going back to just what Roland asked me, like, do banks, no, we don't actually, which I think is part of the challenge that the wine investment has in South Africa.
Thanks, Khensani. Higgo, you wanted to jump in here? Higgo?
I just wanted to comment on, and it might be a little bit abstract, but I think that's part of my role here, is, I think the comments that Richard made earlier about the lack of South African wines in the global scene, I think that's mostly down to our lack of self-belief. And I think we are now starting to see and starting to establish that self-belief. So the point that I'd like to make is not to underestimate the markets. And I think the CWG listening can contest to that. They'll agree to that. They all know how to believe in the market and how to grow a brand. And I think our brands might be supported mostly by a local market, but I think we shouldn't underestimate this local market. I really believe there's a fine wine market emerging in South Africa. They are very interested in fine wine. They compare South African wine to European or to the classic benchmarks. And very often they're very impressed with the result from a South African point of view. So I really think that if we keep this going collectively, that we will start to see South Africa starting to knock on the door of the LiveX 100 and so forth. I'm definitely experiencing a lot of optimism with regards to that. And it's interesting. I want to just quickly comment on Remington's question and comments earlier. I certainly don't believe it's only VDC that has that product credibility at the moment. I think there's quite a lot, and they're coming thick and fast. So it's certainly not only Vinde Constance that has that. We've seen great performance from South African wines from an investment point of view over the past couple of years. So it's not only that brand. And another interesting thing I wanted to comment on was in 2018, Jamie Good tweeted that you have to be bonkers to invest in South African wine. And I really remember those words. And I don't think he would, and I don't think he was wrong, but I don't think he would use those words now, only 2 years later.
Thanks, Higgo. It's really interesting. And I think next to Remington's point about scarcity, I think uniqueness is very important. And I think that's where we need to head to premiumize our country brand, is to really look at things that can help differentiate ourselves, that make us different in a different way, and that drives value. And if you look at the two wines that won 100 points recently, I mean, they are different in a very different way, in a very uniquely South African way. And so that's really, I think, also part of the lesson about investment. But before we get back, and because I want to then start wrapping up, and I want to give all our panelists time just to sum up what they got out of it, what their advice for the future investors, whether they're investing for passion or for emotion, or if they are looking at it as a credible, viable, investable product. Khensani, why, I mean, you've answered it in part, but why has Nedbank, especially with an auction, why do they see the CWG auction, or have seen the CWG auction as a really great partner in the South African wine space?
Yeah, I think it's a great showcase of our brand as South Africa, right? Which is important. We need these industries that help position South Africa globally. And I think wine is definitely something we believe can help do that, to be honest. And we don't have a lot of industries where globally we believe we can make an impact and really position ourselves as differentiated. But I do think that we haven't done, even in South Africa itself. So if you look at someone like me who loves wine, spends a lot of money on wines, I would actually look back at the wine industry and say, I don't think they've done a good enough job of trying to get us to understand, you know, how amazing these brands are, understand that they can be an investment market within it. It's almost like a conversation that's happening amongst a group of people at a braai, and then there's this whole other country outside of it, and no one is bringing us into the conversation. And actually, I think that's absolutely challenging. I mean, I'll just give it like a personal story. So when I turned 40 2 years ago, I had a 40 before 40 list. And one of it was to get a bottle of wine that was actually produced in my year of birth, 1978. And I really struggled to find one. I couldn't find any information that was telling me where to go, how to do, you know, and all of those good things. I finally found one, and I'm not going to say which wine farm it was from because it did not taste well. So I'd rather just not say what wine farm it was from. But you need to understand that there are people, a lot of people like me, who really want to play in the space, but I think the wine industry just hasn't shown up in a way where it's allowed a lot of us to engage, you know, in that way. So for me, from a CWG perspective, I think as a bank, we really want to help transform wine, make it beyond one conversation at a braai and become, you know, a bigger South African narrative, hopefully bring young Black wine, you know, makers into it. And I think that's a challenge that the wine industry really needs to take on.
Thank you, Khensani. And I think let's talk a little bit, just for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up. We're going to give everybody, so just between Higgo first and then Khensani is, you know, what's in it for the consumer? You mentioned emotional value, passion, investment. What attributes are really, are driving investment in wine over time? I mean, Higgo, earlier you mentioned to me things like provenance. You know, we're seeing old vine wines, for example, merging. That could be a marker of quality and meaning for people. What do you think is driving? What are, you know, is it about the brand? Is it about the personality and so forth? Just
I've noted a few things here. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so I certainly feel that collectors looking to buy wines should buy what they love. So that should be the fundamental start, is to buy subjectively, buy what you enjoy, because then you cannot have buyer's remorse then if the wine from an investment point of view don't appreciate with value. You will enjoy what you've bought. If you have to drink it yourself, that's not such a bad thing. But just from a quality point of view, to answer your question, I am divided in two things. One is intrinsic quality and the other one is brand. And unfortunately, you cannot build a fine wine brand without the brand itself. So under brand, there's reputation, which includes consistency. Then there's, of course, price. And then a key one here, and Richard has alluded or touched on that, the whole panel have, is the supply. So the rarity of the supply. And, you know, I think just from if there's customers listening here, from a rarity point of view, don't think in wine something is rare when it has a famous person's signature or something like that on. In wine, rarity is all about terroir. It's as simple as that. It's limited supply because of where it comes from. And then critic scores is another thing with brand, but that then taps into the quality part, the intrinsic, the content. That for me has to have a sense of place. So for a wine to be a quality product or a fine wine, it has to have sense of place. It has to be age worthy. And then from an auction point of view, the final cog in that chain is its provenance. So if we look at reselling something that's not coming straight from the producer, if it's not a primary sell, it's not a young wine being sold, the provenance is key. And that's another thing that Roland mentioned earlier that's only starting to emerge, is people storing wine properly in South Africa. I think that's been a big part of the reason why we haven't had a good secondary market, is because we've had poorly stored old wines cameoing as good wine, you know. So the provenance, the storage, the condition, and of course the authenticity. I think when we start getting to a point where our wine's being counterfeited, we'll probably take it as a compliment. We're not quite there yet. So those are the comments I made on that.
Thank you, Higgo. Khensani, you want to just maybe wrap up and firstly say, well, what's in it for the investor finally, and then what do you think your take on today is? And then following that, I'm just going to give each panelist 1 minute just to sum up for them what they see in the future, what's important about the conversation that we had today.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from a bank perspective, which is going to be interesting advice coming from a bank, right, is that I do think you need to be very clear as you go into wine investments that this is, did you just take a sip of something, Jonathan? Fantastic. But I think that's the point, right? You need to be very clear that what
sorry, I'm actually having this meeting from Steenberg.
Oh,
they just handed me a glass of bubbly, so I didn't refuse it.
Fantastic. But I think, yeah, from my perspective, honestly, it has to be something that, you know, whatever you invest in, I mean, ultimately, actually, you can get to drink it. And I think if you hold that dear, that's an important point, because, I mean, as a bank, we cannot, you know, give you any level of advice when it comes to investing in this space, because there's just not enough data, there's just not enough information. So the only advice that we would give to people is, honestly, do look at it as a passion investment or a passion asset. And so, you know, if things don't work out in the future, at least you can open a, you know, bottle of wine, you know, and drink it, actually, which is fantastic.
Thank you, Khensani. Someone's got to drink it. I play my part. Roland, you've been very quiet, unusually quiet. Maybe you just want to wrap up in 1 minute.
I'd like to finish off with. The first is that we're an extremely young industry and really only just getting onto the second generation of fine wine in South Africa. Although we've been making wine arguably for 350 years, it's really only started in the last 30 or 40 years. The CWG was founded in 1982, and really now we're starting to see the real generational change. So Christo Lariche taking over from Etienne. That generational shift is what fine wine is built on. Italy has multi generations, as does France and Spain. So we're a very young industry, and that's why we still have a long way to go. And secondly, if you look at those CWG prices, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, if you said, you know, wine was 1,000 Rand a bottle, people would have gasped. But I think we've leapt over that 1,000 Rand level, and we're moving towards 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 Rand a bottle for fine wine. And that's the new normal. And I predict that fine wine in South Africa will at least accelerate in price over inflation or the depreciation of the Rand moving forward. And that maybe in 10, 20 years' time, we're going to be talking about wine at 10, 20, 30,000 Rand a bottle.
Thanks, Roland. Richard, you want to come in just to wrap up for 1 minute?
Yes, I think the important thing for South African wine is to raise awareness outside of South Africa and the South African diaspora, as I mentioned before. I think, you know, by selling these wines on an international stage, hopefully that's what we're helping the Cape Winemakers Guild do, to bring those wines to a wider audience. Obviously, it needs to be backed up by putting on tastings, getting good critic scores, and finally, I think the distribution network needs to be examined for South African wines to get good distribution in the right places, not just in London, but in the major capitals of the world, and, you know, where wine collectors are, Hong Kong, where, you know, that people are prepared to buy wine. They're not hidebound by always, you know, if it's not Bordeaux, it can't be good. And I think we just need to expand, and it is happening, as I showed from those figures, that the rest of the world is now becoming a very important part of the fine wine market, and South Africa should be getting a good cut of it, and particularly at the moment when I would say their prices are undervalued in comparison with other fine wines.
Thank you so much, Richard. I appreciate your contribution. Higgo, you want to say one last little thing before we wrap up finally for the day? Higgo?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, I would like to. There's been references made to the perfect scores that we've been receiving, and of course that's not going to stop. There's also been reference made to what's happened with lockdown and online consumer behavior and so forth. And there's been a lot of reference that I've heard in the industry of people calling this a bit of a perfect storm for South African fine wine. But I disagree. I've been seeing an appetite and a desire for establishment of a secondary market and of this emerging fine wine and the rising quality since my involvement with the Nedbank auction in 2011. There's always really been a desire for this to happen, so I don't see this as a flash in the pan. And just out of interest, the 100-point scores, I don't think, what's happening in the industry is not as a result of the 100-point scores. What the 100-point scores are coming as a result of what's happening in the industry. And I think if we all just hold the course and keep this self-belief, we will start to hear different comments coming out of the likes of international viewers as well, or observers.
Thank you. Thank you, Higgo. And thank you to you, Richard, Khensani, Higgo and Roland, very much for your contribution today. It's a subject so worthy of further investigation. It excites me as an academic to have this discussion, and hopefully it's something that I can chat to you individually and collectively about at some stage further. But just a final word of thanks to Kate and Sommelier and the CWG team. They put in an incredible amount of hard work, and thank you for organizing the seminar. And we hope that the audience has enjoyed it, and we wish you well for the auction in October. Thank you, everybody, and we're going to sign off now. Have a lovely day further.
Thank you very much. Bye.